Sorry for the delay, everybody. We had another panel running, but we've wrapped up, and we're so happy and pleased to welcome you to our next event today. I'm Kate Seeley, Vice President for Arts and Culture at the Middle East Institute, and I want to welcome you to a sneak preview of our latest exhibit in this Moonless Black Night Syrian Art After the Uprising, curated by Maymuna Farhat. We're honored to be hosting such a powerful exhibition of Syrian artists to mark the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Uprising. And we're excited to share with you today Maymuna's vision for this very important show. The exhibit opens to the public for timed appointments this Monday, March 8th, and will be up until July 16th. It can also be viewed online, but it's a very tactile show. So please come in and see it in person. You just can't replace that experience. And also, please do spread the word. We're open Mondays through Fridays from 10 to 5. We're closed briefly for lunch, and you can bring up to 3 guests, masked, of course. This is the MEI Art Gallery's 5th exhibition. We opened just a year and a half ago in September 2019 inside MEI's newly renovated headquarters. And we were set up as a showcase to promote artists from the Middle East and to provide a platform for exchange and dialogue around the arts in Washington, D.C. MEI's mission is to educate Americans about the Middle East and to strengthen U.S. Middle East ties. And we feel that there's no more powerful tool with which to do so than, of course, through art and culture. As part of the programming around the show, the Arts and Culture Center will be hosting several panel talks with the artists. Among them is a talk that we're planning with the Goethe Institute here in D.C. in June to explore the work and the impact of the Berlin-based Syrian artists in the show. We're also screening several Syrian films in partnership with Bidayat, a Beirut-based film production company that has been making award-winning documentaries and experimental films about the situation in Syria since 2013. And we'll host several podcasts. So keep a lookout for our spring and summer programming on Syria. Also, if you aren't familiar with our work, please go online to mei.edu to the Arts and Culture tab and experience our previous exhibits and our extensive cultural programming, both prior to and during the pandemic. I also want to thank the Violet Jabara Foundation for their support of the exhibit and the Goethe Institute DC for their support of our programming. We're excited to be chatting with our curator, Maymuna Farhat, today live from inside the gallery. Maymuna is a curator, researcher, and writer whose work is focused on underrepresented artists and forgotten art scenes. Since 2005, she's written widely on 20th and 21st century art, contributing essays and chapters to edited volumes and museums and gallery catalogs. She has curated exhibits throughout the US and abroad, notably at the Center for Book Arts in Manhattan, the Minnesota Museum of American Art, the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn, Art Dubai, and the Beirut Art Exhibition Center. She'll take us through the exhibit in conversation with MEI's Lynn Snedge, the director of our Arts and Culture Center, and then we'll take questions afterwards. But before I hand it over to them, just a few quick housekeeping notes. To submit your questions, please use Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your Zoom screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu. And if you have any technical issues, please email events@mei.edu. Now over to you, Lynn and Maymuna.
Thank you, Kate. And welcome, Maymuna, from our gallery at MEI. We are so pleased and honored to be having this curator talk with you. You have brought together a wonderful show and that tells a beautiful visual story that you're about to tell us all. And with you, I am going to walk to start our journey and story. And I would like you to tell us a little bit more about what the show is about, what the themes of the show are, how many artists, and how many works.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much, Lean. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kenzie. This is really a collaborative effort, and I'm so proud of the show and what we were able to put together. The show's title, In This Moonless Black Night, is adapted from a poem by the Syrian poet Dad Haddad, whose poetry often explores subversive sort of themes, melancholy, alienation, but then also in this particular poem, there's slight glimmers of hope. which I thought was pretty suitable for a show of this subject matter marking the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Uprising and everything that's happened since then. Some of the common themes that you'll see as we go around the gallery are hope, but also trauma, displacement, migration, ruin as well, the difficulties of navigating that. Someone was here earlier and they mentioned the fact that there are a lot of kind of themes surrounding parents and children, families, domestic scenes, interiors, the kind of safety of creating the sense of home no matter where you are. So there are a lot of overlapping sort of themes, but one of the things that we really wanted to emphasize was diversity in media and diversity in experience, diversity in political views, and diversity in artistic practices. So this multi-generational show tries to communicate that and looks at some of the ways in which Syrian art has developed rather quickly in the past decade, since the start of the uprising and the mass exodus of artists from Damascus and Homs and Aleppo.
Fantastic. Tell us quickly, Maimana, before we move on to the first artworks, how many artists are in the show and how many works in total?
There are 14 artists and 32 works.
Thank you. Shall we start here?
Sure. These photographs, or these portraits rather, are by a Minnesota-based artist named Usama Isid, and these were taken in a refugee camp in Turkey. I wanted to start the show with these two portraits in particular because I love this sort of empathetic view that Usama gives us, and the dignified sort of posture of these children, but who at the same time are obviously experiencing intense anxiety. They're trying to adapt as best they can. And I love the offering of the wheat and the flowers as well. And the imagery overall is reminiscent of the films of Abbas Kiarostami, who centers children, especially the earlier films like Where's My Friend's House, where these larger socio-political issues are explored through the eyes of children and their experiences.
Moving on here, we have a beautiful piece.
This piece is by Kavort Murad. He's an Armenian Syrian artist based in New York City. What I love about this work in particular is the sort of theatrical sense that we get. Here, Kavort is playing with negative and positive space, and he has almost two scenes that are shown simultaneously. So we get this sense of, the piece is called The Sanctuary City. So we get this sense of the city rising, but then also perhaps it's falling in the background, and there's this certain ambiguity where the viewer is allowed to sort of fill in the missing pieces in terms of the larger narrative. You have figures here, these kind of classical figures that Kavort does so beautifully, and then the cutout between the two canvases. So I love the idea of pairing Kavort's work with the next artist, Mohammed Hafez, who's based in Connecticut, whose background is in architecture, because I love this idea of looking at space as through the lens of like architecture, but then also the dimensionality of theater. And so if we look at these works closely, they feel like they're stages. And actually in installing them, the suitcase is actually the shell, and then the scene is placed inside. And then almost like a dollhouse, the objects are placed on the stage. So here he uses all these different sort of elements to tell this story.
Is this another of his works?
Yes, so that we have, in the show we have 4. We were very fortunate to include 4 of these pieces. And then these have been shown nationally and internationally. And again, they tell the story of these cities and the destruction that has taken place, the homes, the loss of these spaces, which are so important. And this one in particular is quite moving in the sense that you have this child who's writing graffiti on the wall, which is very emblematic of the early days of the uprising.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which pairs nicely then with the next artist that we have, Tamam Azam. And this image in particular, Freedom Graffiti, went viral after he produced it in 2013. And again, it's this idea of these ruined cities, the destruction that has taken place due to war and fighting, but then also bringing a sense of beauty and a sense of hope, and reminding really the international community of the humanity of Syrians, of everyday Syrians.
Absolutely. We have, I mean, the artists that you've spoken about are very established artists on the Syrian contemporary art scene, aren't they?
Yeah,
Yes.
definitely. What's also nice about thinking about Tamam's work, this specific piece in the series that came from it, the Syrian Museum series, is that at the time, Tamam was living and working in Dubai and had left Damascus, left his studio, left all the materials that he had, and wanted to continue creating work, but didn't have the proper sort of tools and space. So he started working on these digital collages as a way to continue working, but then also this really interesting, process of experimentation.
Yes, the juxtaposition of the two. Yes, absolutely.
Definitely. And I think that spoke to a lot of people too, not only because of the potent imagery, but then also the idea of, working in this medium and, making do with
what you had.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on here, we have a big piece from.
This is by Khaled Baraki. He's an artist based in Germany. This piece is called "I Haven't Slept in Centuries." And if you look closely, what it is there's stamps of entrance, exit, and rejection visas, or rejection of visas or entry to different countries. And it reflects on the difficulties of migration and exile and displacement. But what I love about this piece is this idea of abstraction and communicating really the violence of state bureaucracy and the difficulties that Syrians have had in terms of resettling or the refugee crises, and the kind of violence that bureaucracy really enacts in many kind of ways. So he's creating this very dark sort of psychic space using these stamps. And you can, looking at it, you feel like you can really sort of sense the weight of that experience. So again, the idea of not sleeping for centuries and the toll that that's taken in terms of exile and migration.
Absolutely.
In 2016, Tamam Azam moved to Germany and settled there with his family. And again, he found himself in a similar situation. No real adequate studio space, and the materials were quite different. So he started working in paper collage and on paper. And again, these smaller kind of works, these more intimate works that one can imagine that he's making in his apartment in Germany. And this piece is acrylic on paper, and it kind of continues the larger theme of destruction and ruin that he was exploring in 2013.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of chaos and destruction.
Yeah.
Yes.
And pairing the two artists, Khaled Baraki and Tamam Azam, is also nice too, to look at the, we start to think about the strong and long tradition of painting in Syria, especially a tradition of expressionism and the ways in which paint and these gestural brushstrokes really kind of communicate certain emotions and certain, have like a very effective impact on the viewer. Moving on to this triptych by Nagam Holeifa, who's based in Paris. Here we start to get into the kind of symbolism that Syrian artists are also really well known for. Nagam thinks of these works as body landscapes. So we can look at the imagery and we see body fragmentation. We see that her nightgown actually looks like it's part of a landscape from afar. This might look like a hill or a mountain. This might be the sea. So again, playing with this idea of geography and landscape and the body and the ways in which the body is tied to the land. You think of Syria and the massive displacement of Syrians. And we might also think of memory as well, which is very much a feminist approach to art in that sense too, where the personal is political. So here Naga moves between both of those things, and the personal and the political are definitely inferred.
Absolutely. That is such a graceful and powerful work.
Yeah.
And in a sense, maybe I will ask you to speak a little bit about this. It's, you know, it starts the section where we have a lot of the women's work.
Yes. And I love that term, actually, women's work, because we can play on that a little bit. And as we move on to the next few pieces, you'll see how that unfolds. This is an etching that is partnered with two other etchings that we'll see in a bit, by a Beirut-based artist named Azza Abu Rebeh. And these are works that basically recount her time as a political prisoner in Syria after the start of the uprising. So Nagam, when she talks about these works and about that time in her life, she talks about how after the uprising, art didn't feel like enough, and that she was moved to action, and she felt like she wanted to contribute to building a new society in a certain way. And so she became an activist and actually was swept up in the arrests. So she details her experiences in a women's prison, using techniques that are kind of reminiscent of Goya, the master printmaker, who she loves. And his series in particular, The Horrors of War, we can see kind of the influence of those. This one's titled, "The Bed and White Pillow Became My New Home."
Excuse me, Lynn and Maymana.
Yes.
Just a quick request to please stay still on the images. Too much movement.
Okay.
Thank you. Just stay on the painting. That's a request from several audience members. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you for pointing that out. So this piece is titled Sigh. It's also by Azza. And what she was saying to me when I was asking her about the work, it's part of a smaller body of work, about maybe 4 or 5 paintings, mixed media paintings like this, was that it was a way for her to kind of take a break from the series of etchings that she was producing on her experience in prison. So the title is so apt. I mean, Sigh, it is kind of like, you can see the sort of release that's happening. Color comes in, texture comes in. And here we have, going back to the idea of women's work, right? Which we always think of in terms of embroidery and craft and textile. We have some thread that comes here and forms the body. I like that also there's this overlap with Nagam's work in terms of the body and what the body can represent, what the body carries, what the body holds. Again, very much a tradition of feminist art, and diving into the subjective in order to speak about these larger issues.
Okay. Let's go to the other 2 works of Azza.
These works are quite difficult in their imagery. The bottom work is about an experience that she had where an epilepsy patient wasn't given her medication on time and was having a seizure. And the top one is about just how crowded the cells were. And again, with the reference to Goya, we look here closely and we see bats. And the Lebanese artist Helen Zougaib was here earlier, and she pointed out the fact that, Azza has made a point of detailing the laundry, the hanging laundry, and this idea of care, even in the most difficult of spaces.
Shall we go back?
Yeah.
This
is an artist book by Heba Al-Ansari. She lives in Germany. The title is called The Math Book, and then the subtitle is Art Book Found in Destroyed House in Kafr Nabi, Syria. I loved the idea of this fictional sort of account that an artist book would be found in among the ruin in this town in Syria. Then also, if we look closely in terms of the imagery and the concept of it being sort of mathematical, but then also referencing war with these holes that form through the paper. So we think about like the calculated kind of nature of war but then we also have the destruction. And then if we look down here, we have a needle and thread that seems to be left over from her putting the book together, which is quite intentional. And again, going back to this idea of women's work. And I love the idea too of recording with the needle, where the needle becomes the instrument.
Mm-hmm. Very nice.
This work is titled Pillar of Salt by Minnesota-based artist Esma Imadi. A lot of Esma's work deals with issues affecting women and children, displaced women and children. And here we might think of the salt, of sea salt, and the things that have been left behind by migrants. And just the dangerous journey.
We can see the name of the child written in Arabic inside the backpack as well. Correct.
Yeah. And I believe this work was shown at the Minneapolis Institute of Art recently.
We're going to walk over to here.
These two pieces by Noor Asaliya are actually printed on rice paper. And then the technique is that they are sort of stitched together with this red thread. And according to the artist, her mother has chronic eye issues or an eye disease. And so in a sense, it's kind of an homage to her mother. But then if we also think of the experiences of women during this time and the kind of violence, again, the violence on the body, it becomes very powerful, potent symbols.
Yes, the eye as a witness as well.
Definitely.
That has been, the topic of many projects and many violence.
Right, right. The body as a way of recording. Yeah, yeah. And again, the idea of the thread and the needle as an instrument of recording. I think in terms of Asa's work too, with the etchings, we might think of that as well in terms of like that process of creating those plates that are then printed. Again, it's this very involved sort of cathartic sort of approach to art and creating these images that are very intense and speak to us with the tactile nature of them.
Absolutely. Should we go into Uruba?
Sure. These are by Uruba Diab. She's an artist based in Paris, France. These works actually are on canvas. And then if you look closely, there's sand that she's created the foreground with. And then the figures are formed from what looks to be collaged stationery and then also fabric. I love the whimsy and the emphasis on beauty in Uruba's work, but also this sense of, again, the body carrying this weight, right? That we really can see in terms of like the posture of the figures and the way that the plight is then described.
They are so gentle and graceful at the same time.
They are, yeah.
They seem to be burdened by so much loss and pain.
Yeah, and I mean, I think she really describes the plight of refugees really beautifully too, in the sense that we're reminded of all those pictures of Syrian fathers that we saw carrying their children along the migration path in Europe, and the mothers carrying these big sacks that have probably everything that they were able to grab at the time that they left in such a hurry.
Correct.
And then again, just having the two paintings next to each other too, this long, long, long line of migrants.
That's the journey.
Yeah.
The never-ending journey. Should we go to her sculptures now?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
These smaller works, I love how delicate they are. I wish we didn't have the glass. I would want to touch them. They're so sweet. These two on the pedestals on the smaller kind of platforms are kind of abstract representations of women as they're migrating. And then again, they're possessions that are wrapped in these large cloths that are then carried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, the sculptures are sort of, their poster is the
Yeah.
same as, absolutely. And that is Oruba Dieb, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And it's called Continuous Displacement.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Pairing those works with these two photographs by Usama Isid, whose portraits of children opened the show, I thought was so interesting in the sense that here you have an artist who's bringing in pattern and ornamentation and color in order to communicate a certain sense of resiliency and beauty. And then Usama captured it in these tents of refugees that he met in Turkey. And the beautiful story that goes along with these works is that Usama arrived in the camp and immediately people started inviting him in for coffee and lunch and dinner. And entering these tents, he was taken aback. He couldn't believe how magnificent the insides were of these UN issued tents, and the ways in which the residents actually really made an effort to care for the inside and to create a sense of home as best they could, and to really kind of emphasize beauty, the sense of beauty and comfort and warmth and leisure. It really speaks of the resiliency of these migrants. Then also too, what I like about having these two works, and if we were to look at the other works in the show, is this idea of craftsmanship that really goes back to, it's so ancient in Syria, right? If we think about Syrian visual culture and we think about
Correct.
architecture and material culture and textile works, I'm thinking like inlaid tiles and furniture, everything. And so this really strong emphasis on ornamentation and pattern and craftsmanship, you see it in all of the works actually in one way or another. It's like Syrian artists are continuing that tradition, but with contemporary media.
Absolutely. And the people carry it with them as well.
They carry it with them, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Totally.
And for me too, I think moments of joy are indications of resilience and resistance to one's circumstances, and also beauty.
Absolutely. Okay.
These works on opposite walls are by an artist who's actually now doing a residency in Japan, but he's usually based in Paris, born and raised there. His name's Badi Dalul. His parents are actually well-known Syrian artists. He spent a lot of time going between Syria and France as a child. And the works actually reference the experiences that he and his brother had of creating these sort of games, these imaginative games as children, where they would pretend that they were the rulers of their own universes. And so they would, every detail would be thought out and articulated, from governance to here we have tourism and migration, to experiences as adults. So I love the whimsy in these works, the kind of introspective nature of the works in themselves. They don't directly reference the last decade and the Syrian situation, but there are inferences and this larger kind of universal themes of governance and independence and one's destiny.
Absolutely.
And again, the
so
references
beautiful.
to,
so detailed. My image possibly does not do them justice, nor any of the other works that we've spoken about, but those are particularly, detailed.
They remind me of like backgammon tables, towels that you could find in Damascus.
Yes.
Also with the ceramic and the tile, we might think of like this Silk Road kind of trade that would happen. They remind me a little bit of Chinese dominoes, but then also we might think of just the ceramic production in Damascus that it was famous for under the Ottoman Empire.
Correct. And he does reference some of his work back to the Ottoman Empire. And yes. Should we move to this film and video that's going on. Would you like to tell us what this is about and who is it from?
This is by an artist based in Germany. He's an artist and filmmaker, all-around thinker. His name's Ammar El-Baik, and this film is called The Sun's Incubator. And I have to point out that the title of this show is also an homage to a film that Ammar co-directed and did the cinematography for by Hala Abdullah, who's a Syrian filmmaker based in Paris. And it's titled, I'm the One Who Brings Flowers to Her Grave. And that title is also taken from a poem by Dad Haddad. And so that actually is available online if you know, whoever's watching is interested in seeing it, you can, I think it's on YouTube. It's an amazing film that sort of revisits artists who have been exiled, but then also some that are still living in the country, some that have been imprisoned. It's a very important film.
Okay.
This film in particular is called The Sun's Incubator. It was made shortly after the uprising, while Ammar and his wife and infant child were living in Beirut. Ammar found himself in his apartment caring for their infant child while his wife Miriam worked at a gallery, and while the protests were unfolding around him.
Okay.
This piece is by Laura Haddad.
I have to move back so that people can
Sure.
see this whole. Okay.
This is a piece produced by Laura Haddad, an artist based in Tucson. This was produced while she was getting her MFA at the University of Arizona at Tucson. They have an amazing photography MFA program there. And it's actually printed on a blanket. So the reference is the receiving blankets that the UN would pass out to refugees.
Correct.
And, the idea
And it says in Arabic, tathir, which is
cleansing.
cleansing.
But again, it's an ambiguous image, right? We don't know what the specific details are of this particular event, and what's kind of unfolded in terms of the different international players and local players and regional.
Correct. Okay, we're coming now to our last piece here.
This is by Khaled Baraki. He's the same artist who had the larger print with the bureaucratic stamps, and it's a light box that looks exactly like an exit sign.
And it says exile, of course. Yeah, very, very powerful. And Khaled has played on this exile, tragedy and sarcasm at the same time.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our tour, and I'm going to, without making anybody dizzy, as slowly as I can, I'm going to turn back to Maymana so that people can see the gallery as well. And then, Kate, if you want to feed some questions to us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, Maymana, for that wonderful tour. I've learned so much, and it's important because Lynn and I will now be giving the same tour to our visitors for the next 4 months.
Great.
So let me bring our audience in. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is from Jessica Banout, and she asks, the Syrian art scene prior to the uprising was so vibrant, even if subject to government censorship. What is happening in the country now, and would these works be allowed to be shown in the country?
Well, the Syrian art scene before the uprising, definitely. I love that observation because it was vibrant and it had been opening up, and artists were really starting to exhibit regionally and then abroad. A lot of artists were traveling to Asia. Many were traveling to Europe for exhibition opportunities. So it was becoming the sort of hub in the region. But the restrictions were definitely still there. I worked for a gallery in Damascus, and all of our shows had to be approved by the government. And artists were still working with very subversive imagery. I'm not so sure if these works would be shown, in the sense that it feels like there's kind of a suspicion of artists that are living abroad, even if their work is not directly political. Things are very tense still. There are artists who are living and working in Syria. We had hoped to include a few, but it's just so difficult in terms of transporting the work out and then returning it. But there are artists who are active and who are working to rebuild the art scene as best they can. There's the artist in Aleppo, Issa Touma, who was a gallerist before the outbreak of the war, and has continued supporting artists there as well. So, I mean, they're trying as best as they can, and I'm hopeful. I am hopeful.
Wonderful. Tell me, Maimuna, talk a little bit about how the work of Syrian artists has changed over the past decade, you know, in reaction to the conflict, the displacement, exile, etc. I know the practice has changed significantly, and it'd be great if you could talk about that.
In terms of media, I think is probably the most apparent way that Syrian art has changed. And that's partially because, as Amar al-Baik pointed out a couple of weeks ago, the uprising and what followed kind of saw an upsurge in creativity. There was a sort of release. And once artists were living and working outside of Syria, of course, they were exposed to different aesthetics and medium and technique. But they also really, it seems to me at least, really worked through the process of experimentation on their own and really took their individual practices to, you know, they advanced them and really pushed for experimenting and really honing in on what they had been trying to do before while they were still living and working in Syria. So like if we take an artist like Azza, for example, she's trained in printmaking at the University of Damascus Faculty of Fine Arts, if I'm not mistaken, which has a very strong tradition of printmaking. And so again, she, you know, even though she's in exile, she's still working with that media, but then obviously she's experimenting as well. As we see with the larger canvas, she's incorporating fiber and collage and color, also different types of figuration in terms of much more stylized. So I think with being in exile, artists have really allowed themselves to experiment and allowed themselves to try out different things. But then also are looking for different ways to engage international audiences as well, without losing, of course, the strong sense of craftsmanship and aesthetics that, you know, that they grew up around and trained in Syria.
Thank you. We have a question here. Were any LGBT artists allowed to exhibit in Syria before the uprising? Are any of the Syrian diaspora artists openly LGBTQ?
Yes, I can't really speak to what the situation was like in Syria in terms of artists exhibiting and those kinds of themes being openly exhibited. But yes, there are definitely some artists that identify as such. But yeah, I don't, unfortunately, I don't know.
A couple more questions coming in. Are any of these artists planning to go back to their homeland? And are there artists that the Syrian regime are specifically supporting? So anybody planning to go back, do you think, given what you know? And who is the regime supporting? Do they support the arts?
I don't know. I don't keep tabs on the regime. I think I'm sure. I mean, regimes have always worked with artists, right? I mean, that idea of government patronage is as old as time. So I'm pretty sure that that's probably happening. Again, you can't really, to be fair to artists that are in Syria, and to be fair to artists that are working outside, you can't really kind of assume anything in terms of looking at their work, in terms of the types of activities that they participate in. It's a very tricky situation in Syria, and it always has been for artists, and artists have really learned to navigate that in different ways. So some might produce subversive imagery, some might not participate, or some do participate. It's really something that artists have had to really figure out and to deal with on an individual basis. So again, I can't speak to that because I wouldn't want to speak for them and assume things.
And from what you know, do you think anyone would be planning to go back, or is it your sense that, you know, once these artists are in exile, you know, they're sort of viewed as such, and it would be very hard to go back?
I mean, we really don't know what the situation is going to be, right? I mean, we don't know what's in store for Syria and what could happen, within the next decade or 2 decades. If we look at the situation in Lebanon, for example, during the civil war, and the many artists that had left during that time, some returned, some didn't. In times of peace, I think, life happens too. I think some artists are hoping to go back. And it would be amazing if they did, because the experiences and again, the really strong sense of experimentation that they've all reflected in their work would be great for Syria and the art scene there. I think the art scene would really benefit from their insights and from their talent. But I mean, I'm hopeful. I hope they do, but I can't really say.
Right. And can you talk, Mayman, a little bit about how you view sort of international support and recognition of these artists? I mean, are they getting the kind of recognition they deserve? Are their works selling? Are they making a living? What kind of a struggle have you seen these sort of artists in exile in Germany, France, and the US? What sort of challenges have you seen them facing to, produce and make a living and be recognized?
Artists that have settled in Europe have had a much easier time. And I'm not going to say that doesn't mean that they haven't faced difficulties and xenophobia and rejection from the art world. But what I found is that galleries, for example, are much more inclined and more open to representing Syrian artists than you would say galleries here in the States. Museums as well in Europe, I think probably because the refugee crisis has really impacted Europe in the last 10 years. Museums have then taken the initiative to reflect on that crisis, to explore it, to educate the public. So I think that the reception has been better in that sense in Europe, because there is a sense of immediacy, and Syrian artists that are seen as really being able to speak about those things and really provide unique insights in that sense. Some artists in the US have. I mean, like I mentioned that Asma's work was shown at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. I think the support tends to be very local in terms of where the artist is based. Kevork has been in New York for a very long time and has shown extensively in New York, so his support is there. But I know he's also shown in Toronto as well, and then internationally. My hope is that with shows like this, where the emphasis is on diversity of media, and then also this long, rich tradition of aesthetics and artistic practice coming out of Syria, is that then international audiences will start to understand that this is not something that just kind of came from this crisis, but really it's been a long time in the making, and that Syrian artists have been working at the level of other international artists for quite a long time.
Wonderful. Any final thoughts, Mayman, or question, Lynn, as we start to wrap up?
I don't think so. Any last comments, Maymana, as to what this means to have this show now, perhaps in Washington, D.C.? Those are artists that have not been shown in D.C. before. At least most of them, I can't tell for a few, but what does it mean for you as a curator to have this show now in Washington?
I think it's so important. And a lot of our work as cultural workers, right? I mean, we can speak to this, stems from a sense of advocacy, right? A sense of commitment and really a really strong sense of love too.
Absolutely.
So I feel like this is where the show is coming from. My hope is that, again, people will come and see the works in person and just to see how incredible these artists are and how much work and thought and time and energy and labor and love that they've put into these works, and really their sort of relentless commitment to ordinary Syrians. That commitment was there while they were living and working in Syria, and they carried it with them. And I think that they've done a wonderful job of representing some of these really difficult issues for an international audience.
Absolutely. And for us, not to forget the stories and the tragedy and the human experiences. I mean, this show, in a sense, is focused on Syria, but transcends Syria, right? It transcends Syria to speak about humanity and struggles and movements and hope and despair.
Definitely, and the resiliency of artists. I mean, if I look at Tamam's work and I think about him being in exile in Germany, I immediately think of Max Beckmann being exiled in Amsterdam and the really important, intense body of work that he produced there. So this is definitely reflective of universal condition, and artists in particular have this advantage in which they can speak to these things in ways that really compel us and make us pay attention.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you, Maimuna, for that wonderful tour. And thank you, Lynn, for your camera work. And thank you to all the artists for participating in this show. It really is such an honor to feature you in Washington, D.C. at this time. And on, marking this 10th year anniversary. I just want to note that a lot of our audience has written and said the breadth and selection of the artwork is superb and they can't wait to come in and see it. So let me just remind our audience that the show is up through July 16th. It is open Monday through Friday from 10 to 5 p.m. We take off about an hour and a half at lunch. So midday we're closed. And make a timed appointment. You can go to mei.edu to the arts and culture page, and you'll find the link for a timed appointment. You can bring up to 3 guests, masked, of course. And if we're in the gallery, Lynn or I, we will give you another tour. But in any case, it is such a delight to host this. And please look out for more mailers about panel talks with the artists and Maimuna again in the future, and hope to see you all in the gallery. Thank you.